So good evening to all who have joined this program initiated by the Center for Urban Studies. And the Center for Urban Studies started with different academic interactions in the pandemic context. And we are very happy to share with you that the first speaker who started off these interactions, Professor Sanjay Srivastava, British Academy Global Professor, he has also joined this event. So it's very happy to, and I just wanted to express that. And this time there is a difference because there is a small collective of ethnographers, young ethnographers who are coming up in the university, and they have been very active in pursuing field research and getting into the business of doing ethnography. And this particular talk is very much an initiative on discussion with this group of ethnographers, and all of them are present in this meeting. And so are many who always join our interactives in a very active way: students, ex-students, researchers, as well as comrades in academic pursuits. I'm more than happy that today we have a very interesting speaker about whom the work of whose I came across, especially in the method that she was carrying out the research, using a camera in a peculiar kind of a way, working on the ethnographic study, the matter that he was pursuing. And today we have Myriam Amri from Harvard University speaking about a contraband banknote and currency on TV, the materiality of money, insights from Tunisia. Today, we start off with a welcome by Tina Maria Saju of the Ethnography Collective, and we right away go into Myriam's talk. Thank you very much, all of you, once again.
Hello everyone, I'm Tina Maria Saju from IMPSS Ethnography Collective. As already said, today we are here to attend the talks by Myriam Amri, PhD scholar from Harvard University, initiated by Center for Urban Studies in School of International Relation and Politics with IMPSS Ethnography Collection, MG University. As a member of the group, I can say that our classes are always a friendly platform for discussing about all aspects of the society, and it always helps us to develop observation capacity in each and every minute aspect. And now we are going to hear about the topic from Myriam Amri. Our topic is a contraband banknote and a currency on TV, the materiality of money, insight from Tunisia. And I welcome ma'am to this meeting on behalf of everyone present here, and thank you.
Okay, I think it's my turn. Hi everyone, do you all hear me and see me well?
Yes.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here, to be talking to everyone. I'm currently in Tunis for my research, so it's kind of nice to have this also like Global South conversation, and I hope we can benefit from it. And thank you to all of those who are attending. Thank you so much to Mathew for inviting me. I'm gonna share my screen, so bear with me for a second. Okay. Do you all see my screen?
It's yet to appear. Is it
okay.
Yes, it's now coming. Yes.
Okay. Oh, amazing. Okay, let me just. Okay. So let me just kind of organize my little. Okay. Okay. I think like this, it's fine. Okay. Okay. So What I want to do today, I think I'll talk for about 40 minutes. If it becomes too long, someone stops me, because money is an endless topic. But what I want to do is just kind of sort of keep this a bit informal. I'm going to just share some of the ways that I got to thinking about my topic. I'm going to show images, some that I will discuss, some that are just sort of in the background, so just kind of also soak the visual aspects of what I'm going to show, and we can come back to this to kind of any questions you have during the Q&A, so don't hesitate. And I want to start this conversation by showing a few images and just kind of talking about them. So the first one that you see on the left is a banknote of a 10 dinar, 10 Tunisian dinar, and written on it is a kind of slogan that says, "Where is the oil?" And so a few years ago, there was kind of an idea, a sort of conspiracy theory that circulated a lot on social media, that there was oil, petrol in Tunisia, because Tunisia is in between Libya and Algeria in North Africa, both of which are kind of two oil exporting countries. And so the idea that Tunisia doesn't have oil seems strange to people. So in order for the slogan to spread, people started writing, "Where is the oil?" that you can see here on the banknote. And the second image is an image that the customs, the Tunisian police customs, posted on their Facebook page. So they have a very active Facebook page. I'll show some other images. It's quite wild, actually, where they post images of the arrests. And so they posted this image where you see like a banknotes of 10 dinar and 20 dinar over a printer. And so actually what they were saying is that they found this kind of counterfeit scheme of young people who were counterfeiting the banknotes using like regular printers and regular papers. And so they kind of took a photo of the printer with the fake banknotes. So the banknotes you see on top are fake on it, and just kind of saying, "This is the latest arrest that we did." Among a few other images. So this one is about a few years ago, and there were new banknotes released of 20 dinars. And then some people on social media, again, so a lot of these kind of stories usually start on social media and kind of spread, which, is not necessarily just the case in Tunisia, but in a lot of other countries. And so the story spread that actually the central bank had issued counterfeit banknotes, because the line where you can see it's circled in green wasn't the same. It wasn't in the same position in every banknote. So people were saying, okay, the money we're getting, this new money that just came out, is actually already fake. And so in response, the central bank kind of posted or sent a press release. And in the press release, they took photographs of other banknotes. So you see the British pound. The one on top is a banknote from Bahrain, a country in the Arabian Gulf. And they were saying, but look, even in these countries, the security line is also not exactly always on the same position in every banknote. So there's nothing wrong with these new banknotes of 20. And so what I want to do today, kind of taking these examples, but also I'm going to talk about two particular stories. One is on a banknote, and the first one that I'm going to start with is on kind of TV footage that circulated. But kind of, I just wanted to spark your imagination with these kind of images to just show how actually two things, how visual money is and how it doesn't just circulate in kind of the form or it's in the kind of forms of banknotes or credit cards, but that images of money circulate and they come to say something about kind of a country, about a state, about a politics of suspicion, about idea around counterfeit or conspiracy. So kind of just keeping these examples in mind. And what I want to do more specifically today is kind of two things. So first, theoretically, I want to think about the link between money and currency. So what's currency, what's money in contrast, and what's the link between both? And within that, I really want to insist on the idea of materiality, which is that the form, the sensory aspects of a coin and a banknote are important because they tell us something about the political and the social world of a space. And for me, materiality means really like the form money takes, the ways that it changes through time or through different events, and its circulation. So how it's passing through, not just the physical money, but like I was saying, also the images or other things that index money. And methodologically, and this is kind of a point that I want to stress out throughout the talk, I want us to think about materiality in the sense that to do that, we have to attune ourselves to money a bit differently. That money is not just a symbol or a metaphor. It's not just a medium of exchange, but it's an object. It's an object in of itself, whose form is never static. We can talk about banknotes, we can talk about coin, we can talk about credit card, we can talk about kind of other abstractions. Legal contracts sometimes take the place of money. So there's myriads of ways that money comes to permeate our lives. And that its form is never static, and that in kind of thinking about the materiality of money, we sort of have to think about that changing form. And so, so some of the questions I want to ask is kind of, how do we approach the object money? If we come to take seriously that money is an object, how do we approach it? And in that, methodologically, I want to think about the relation between the material and the visual. How does money become a visual object that circulates? And what do we do when we follow the money? And it's sort of, you know, a very popular expression, follow the money, that is usually used by like journalists to say, okay, this is kind of when they're investigating things, they follow the money. But I want to play with that expression and think about how do we follow the money a bit differently. And spatially, so my research is on Tunisia, which is in North Africa. I've been working on Tunisia, and I've been working a bit on Tunisia's borders with Algeria and Libya. So it's kind of the space where the research is, but I think it's, and I think, you know, some of you who maybe do ethnography or just kind of social sciences in general, right? The spaces or the context of the research are often parallel to other spaces. So I want you all to sort of not necessarily just think about Tunisia, but just think about how this might apply to some of the spaces you're looking at. And I'm hoping that in the Q&A, we can talk more about kind of how generalizable can we think about money in different spaces, you know, that cut across regions, that cut across different themes. And so, to sort of get us started, I thought that I would set the terms of the research, which is that often when I try to think about what I'm doing, I try to sort of address how I got there, which is like how basically I came to think about money in the way that I did. And so this is kind of the first story that I want to tell, which is the kind of the subtitle of the currency on TV, because I think it does tell us a lot about kind of the particular relations of money and currency in the space that I'm working at. Okay, I'll show these other images a bit later, but I want to just stay on this one for a bit. So, and I think that the best way to understand kind of one's research is to trace how they came into the research, which is what I was saying, and what has become emerging. And I think this is an important ethnographic take, which is that it's not necessarily about your hypothesis or what the research what the researcher deems central, but kind of what becomes inescapable in the research. And in ethnographic fieldwork, it's often kind of the routine, repetitive kind of repetition. So what people keep saying over and over again, or showing over and over again. So the kind of discourses or practices that become at some point impossible to put aside. And so when I started my research, I was inherently interested in indebtedness and dispossession. I wanted to think about the scales of debt. I wanted to think about how do we link people's individual, debt relations to groups' debt relation to the state debt relation, because Tunisia is a sort of very pervasive debt economy. People take consumption loans, kind of the state is very indebted. So I wanted to think about that scale. And then I realized that people actually didn't talk about debt. they talked about the absence of money. And so there's a word in Tunisian Arabic to say money, it's flus. And people would invert the word. Instead of saying flus, they would say fles. So they would change kind of one of the vowels. And fles meant indebtedness. It meant a kind of state of lack of money. So instead of talking about debt, people often just talked about not having money. And they talked about it in a very material way. It wasn't just kind of abstractly not having money, but it was very tangible. And I realized that it was tangible across social classes. So a lot of people, I did interviews, for example, with a lot of female factory workers, which are often the only breadwinners in their family, and they would talk about money by counting. So they made a mental note of everything that they got and everything that they spent, and they kept just kind of comparing both to the cent. It was actually quite crazy. They would tell me their entire month budget, year budget, week budget, day budget, just by kind of mentally, just by counting. And then I realized, so this is kind of in a more working class background, but in a more kind of a upper middle class background, people knew a lot about the exchange rate. So they knew how much the dinar was in comparison to other currency, usually the euro and usually the dollar too, but also neighboring currency, the Algerian dinar, the Libyan dinar. And they would talk about that every time. They would say like, oh, now the dinar is 3 times less than the euro. They would say 3.5 less, 3.6, and it would be kind of part of everyday conversations. And I was a bit puzzled by it in the beginning, and I thought that maybe I was overinterpreting it, but it kept coming back. And I realized that what the exchange rate, the dinar to the euro, for example, mirrored is kind of an impossibility to access Western goods, and by extension to access a kind of certain Western lifestyle, because the dinar value was falling so much that it was very hard to kind of have your dinars and have that be, a reasonable sum in euros, for example. And so to understand kind of these examples a bit better, I want to go back to a bit of context. So in 2011, which is like a bit more than a decade now, there was a popular uprising in Tunisia. So Tunisia used to be a kind of a dictatorship, pretty centralized, pretty totalizing one. And there were popular protests that started in rural regions in the country and that spread to the capital in 2011. And that led to the fall of the dictatorship. Like the dictator, Ben Ali at the time, literally fled the country. It was on the 14th of January, 2011. And that was also, maybe you have heard of it, but that was also the kind of first spark of the Arab Spring of 2011 and 2012, which led to protests, in Egypt, in Syria, in Bahrain, in Libya. So in a lot of other Arab countries, it sort of started in Tunisia. And obviously in every country, there were different reasons and different dynamics at play. But in Tunisia, a lot of why people protested, it's a small country. Ethnically, it's quite homogeneous. Religiously, it's like 99% Sunnis, so Muslim Sunnis. So it was, but a lot of the demands for the revolution, people call it the revolution or the uprising, was for what people call dignity. It was for dignity and bread, because bread was the symbol of having access to a decent lifestyle, to goods, to things that make you live. And dignity was about a kind of sense of like having political agency in some way, being able to sort of be a citizen rather than a subject in your own country. And so this frame of the revolution has become an extremely important way for people to make sense of their own time. The revolution became a kind of marking point at which people talked about what happened before the revolution and what happened after the revolution. And a lot of the time, I have some sort of images that I wanted to show. A lot of the time, to talk about the revolution meant to critique the sort of gap between people's aspiration, kind of the revolutionary dreams of 2011, and then what happened after. And what happened after and what has been happening since, so we're still in the middle of this as I'm talking, is an economic crisis that kept going, and that has been characterized by a kind of inflation. So the inflation has been rising since 2011. So that means the rise of prices, the fall of the dinar, as I was talking about, the fall of the dinar in comparison to other currency, unemployment rates, regional disequilibriums. And so that has been people's sense of time and everyday life since 2011. And so for me, a kind of social scientist, it was very hard to make sense of this kind of chronology, the way that people, you would ask them about kind of economic processes, let's say, and they would always respond before and after the revolution. Because, like as a social scientist, I understood that economic, social, and political processes always had a longer history, right? They weren't marked by this kind of brutal rupture. But even people themselves would acknowledge that actually, yes, the economic crisis has been looming since forever. We can also trace it back to the sort of, world economic crisis of 2008 and things like that. But they would still hold on to this before and after the revolution. And kind of one example, I was talking about the female factory worker earlier, was the kind of, I was talking to a female factory worker who said the same. She was like, this was the case before and this was the case after the revolution. And when I pushed her a bit, she, had a completely different analysis of how actually her own work condition had changed from like the early 2000s and things like that. But she held on to the idea of the revolution. Sorry,
sorry, I think one of the microphones is on. Ronald, could you please turn the microphone off? Yeah, thank you. Okay. Thank you very much.
No worries, little break. But yeah, so people held on to this idea of the narrative. And I realized that I couldn't just throw that away. And that what the revolution, this 2011 break that people insisted on, though they were aware that they were longer processes themselves, they didn't need me, a social scientist, to tell them that. But the revolution brought new imaginaries, new visual imaginaries in particular, right? Like imagine the country before was a very sort of controlled dictatorship. That means that the media was controlled, social media was controlled. And kind of the revolution brought an entire break with that. And so with that break came new images, new discourses, and that in addition to that, there were actual material changes that the revolution brought. And one of them was actually that Tunisia used to be a kind of more closed off. It's a small country. People didn't really care about it outside, of Tunisians. And so it was sort of sheltered from a kind of neoliberal process. But when the revolution happened, then all these kind of international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, but also a lot of, Western actors like the European Union started to kind of see that this country wasn't liberal enough. It was very state controlled. There was a lot of, the economy was controlled by the state a lot. And so they tried to implement a lot of neoliberal, kind of what we call neoliberal policies into the country. And that brought actual changes too, right? So on the one hand, the revolution brought all these discursive visual changes. And on the other hand, it brought material transformation that are still ongoing as we're speaking now. There's this week, actually, there's new negotiations with the IMF and the World Bank for a new loan package, right? So this is something that is still very much unfolding. And so one of the stories that marked the post-revolutionary imaginary was as kind of a TV, how do we call it? Like this TV investigation that came out like a few months after, and that people have been referring to ever since. And I'm going to show you a little clip of the video, and then I'm going to talk about it. Let me just, okay, I have it. Okay, I think I need to, okay, bear with me. I need to okay. Yep. Do you see my screen?
It's yet to appear.
Oh,
yeah, now it's coming. Now it's coming.
Okay, amazing. So it's a video. It's on. It was on national TV just a few months after the revolution. The presenters are speaking in Arabic, but I just want you to sort of focus on the images and what you're seeing, and then we're going to talk about it. So, okay.
كالثورة بدون شك ستودع اليوم في البنك المركزي وتؤمن، وبدون شك هذه الأموال طبيعي أنها ترجع للشعب التونسي.
شاهدوا انظروا وتمعنوا واكتشفوا ماذا فعلوا في شعبها. أموال بالمليارات مسؤولة تماما كما جاءت من البنك المركزي عليها اسم البنك والتاريخ. أموال تأتي مباشرة من خزائن البنك المركزي إلى خزائن قصر إقامة الرئيس المخلوع وعائلته في سيدي بوسعيد. كيف جاءت؟ التحقيق سيثبت اليورو وأموال بالدينار وأخرى بالعملة الأجنبية، اليورو والدولار والطليعة، وبعدها عملات أخرى حتى التركية والمصرية واللبنانية. مكتوب على النص خلينا الفلوس إخفاء الأموال والمجوهرات في خزائن القصر تم بطريقة محكمة. هذه مثلا مكتبة تعتقد أن الرئيس المخلوع وعائلته يطالعون نفائس الكتب، والحقيقة أنهم يطالعون شيئا آخر: الدينار والدولار واليورو والذهب والمجوهرات والساعات الثمينة. أخفوها بكميات رهيبة بطريقة تنم على أن الجماعة حكموا.
I'll stop here. I'm gonna reshare my screen to go back to the presentation, and then okay. Okay, amazing. Okay, so actually, so in February 2011, so a month after the dictator Ben Ali fled, a media channel went with central bank employees. So the men you see on the video are central bank employees, because they found secret safes in the palace, in the presidential palace, of banknotes. And you can see there's like euros, there's like dollar, and there's banknotes that just came out of kind of the printers. So they still have the sort of central bank code on it, and they haven't been put into circulation of Tunisian currency. And they found, like, I mean, you can see it's like bookcases that sort of very like filmic bookcases that you open and you find all these kind of piles and piles of foreign and local currency. And that came out on national TV, and it was kind of a really crystallized people's imaginary, not just of like the dictatorship, but of corruption, of wealth, and of what money comes to be, what money is for Tunisians. And actually every few years, there's a new kind of a media buzz on this video, like, and a lot of the media buzz is kind of about where is all that money, like that, you know, people saw on their own eyes on TV a month after the revolution. And so when I started, when I was doing my research last year, I worked at the central bank for a few months. And so I was trying to figure out kind of like, oh, the story from the central bank sides. And it was a completely different story from kind of what you see on the TV footage. The first thing was that the central bank was, and I was talking to the press attaché of the central bank, so the person who handles like the media and communication. They were, at the time that I started doing the research at the bank last year, the story had come out again. So there was all these like buzz on social media, like, oh, do you remember the video from February 2011? Where is all that money now? You know, and it came out because like the state was saying that its budget was lower, there was an economic crisis, there were no loans from like foreign agencies anymore because the sort of adjustment programs hadn't been met. And so people were like, but I thought we had money because we opened all these safes and there were so much cash in it. So let's just put back, let's just, you know, fill the state budget with that. And so when I asked at the central bank about the video, it was actually it wasn't supposed to be filmed. It was a technical mission of the central bank to kind of go see this cash to authentify it. Was it real cash? Was it fake currency? Kind of what types of currency were in these safes and things like that. But someone from the bank had invited the press, had invited the sort of national TV without realizing the consequences. And so the men who are speaking and kind of showing the money are actually just doing an audit. And they didn't even think, they thought it would be sort of filmed for private reason. They didn't think it would go on national TV. So they're really just sort of showing the money as they're auditing it. They're saying like, oh, there's this amount of dollars. There are this amount of like Turkish lira, of euros, of Tunisian dinar, and someone else that we don't see on screen is kind of writing them down. And the second thing was that the money obviously was never brought back to the central bank, because when there's money from an investigation, a police investigation, it doesn't go back to the bank. It sort of goes through years into court, because it becomes evidence for court cases. And then after that, it goes into the national treasury. And so a lot of the court cases on the dictatorship and on the dictator and his family are still ongoing. So the money is kind of stuck in kind of, you know, in the Ministry of Interior, in between courts and things like that, because it's still evidence for ongoing investigations. And kind of that story became very important for me, because it made me think first about kind of like what crystallized people's imaginary when they thought about money, and especially when they thought about money after the revolution. But it also mirrored two things: the kind of mutual constitution of trafficking, converting fake money, converting currency with real money, right? So here you have like the center of power, and you have kind of all these ideas about money trafficking, corruption, probably maybe fake money, because there's all these central bank kind of little stickers on them. So people were saying, is this real money? Is this fake money? Was it printed extra? Is this part of like the amounts of money that we're printing? And then it became methodologically a way to kind of trace back, right? Like what type of things linked to this idea of the revolution that people keep bringing back actually relate specifically to money. So this was kind of the first part of what I wanted to talk about, and I'll come back to it at the end. The second part, and I'm starting to run out of time, but I'm going to try to keep it short, is that when I was kind of playing with this notion of following the money, I realized that there was a specific banknote that people talked about all the time. And it's a banknote that is currently in circulation. So it's the highest banknote of the Tunisian dinar. It's the 50 that you see here. This is a scan of the banknote. And when I started doing fieldwork, something strange started happening. And I was really sort of, I hadn't anticipated that at all. People were talking about the banknote, this banknote in particular, a lot, and they were saying that the banknote was disappearing. And they kept mentioning that. They kept saying the banknote, the 50 dinar, is disappearing. And just to sort of give you a bit of context, so Tunisia is a very strong cash economy. And it's also like people use cash a lot. There are credit cards and things, and you know, other means of payment, but people hold on to cash for different reasons. And they've been holding on to cash even more since the revolution, right? Because kind of unstable time, crisis, and things like that. So cash becomes a very important kind of moments of crisis. But it's also a country where there's a very strong informal economy, right? So an economy that is informalized, that can go from kind of people who don't have contracts to kind of contraband at the border, right? It spans a whole spectrum of different economic activities. And so these two things, the sort of cash is king and the informal economy, meant that kind of banknotes especially were kind of a very central part of people's everyday life. And so just, I wanted to show, before I kind of explain the story of the disappearance of the 50 dinar, I wanted to show how banknotes looked like before the revolution. These are more 50 dinar images, but so right after Tunisia's independence, it was a country that was colonized by the French. Right after the independence, the sort of independence leader, Habib Bourguiba, was on every banknote. because he was a kind of personification of kind of independence from colonial rule. He had a very strong following, and so kind of he was on every banknote, right? And then there was a coup in the 80s, and the dictator, the one who left in 2011, replaced him. Bourguiba was very old, so it was kind of a arranged coup d'etat. But the problem was that the new dictatorship didn't have the following that Bourguiba had. So he changed the banknotes completely because he was trying to mark a rupture. And I think in the Q&A, we could talk about the sort of like role of political symbolism on banknotes. But he had to kind of, let me show you. But he couldn't put his face because he didn't have the same following as kind of as the president before. So he started putting very old figures. This is kind of a medieval scholar. The other one is a poet from like the 18th century. And then he started putting symbolism of the coup. So the coup was on the 7th of November. So he would put 7th of November. Also ideas about modernity and things like that. But there was never his face on it. So even the sort of the political symbolism of banknote became more abstract in that period. So just as kind of a way to give you that. And then during he was the one who kind of installed the 50, and this was the 50 before the revolution. And when the revolution happened, so every 2 years, and in most countries, you have to kind of produce new banknotes because, you know, they get old, they get lost, people store them instead of kind of circulating them back. So you have to either reprint the same banknotes or make new ones, depending on kind of the different strategies at play. So people, the central bank was going to just sort of print again these banknotes. And then the revolution happened. As you know, they had you usually have to have a 1-year delay. You say like next year we're printing new banknotes. So that's what they said. So that's why they hadn't planned for the revolution. And then when the revolution happened, they didn't know what to do because so the purple kind of aesthetic of these banknotes was one of the sort of color of the dictatorship. So they couldn't, even though there was nothing related to the dictatorship per se, they couldn't because people knew purple meant the dictatorship. So they couldn't reprint it. So this is images of the sort of central bank. So they kind of kept around the same decors. I'll go more into details in the Q&A about kind of what's on it if you want. But they changed the color. They put it back into green, which was kind of a, you know, a little change, but not too much. And then, so I was doing research, I was doing kind of interviews at private banks. And one of the bankers was telling me that actually there was something wrong with the 50. He was saying that the 50 dinar was disappearing. He was like, oh, you know, we get 10 dinars, we get 20 dinars, but we don't get 50 dinars. And when we do, we keep them because we don't want to put them back. We don't want to give them back to people. And I was like, oh, this is very strange. Why wouldn't you give back this banknote in particular? And he just sort of looked at me as if I was, you know, a bit naive or something. He was like, well, you know, like everyone knows this is the contraband banknote. And I was sort of very shocked. I was like, what? No, I was probably, am I the only one in Tunisia who doesn't know that? So what he meant by the contraband banknote, he was saying that smugglers at the border, contraband traffickers, were using, instead of using, you know, currency in general, were only using the 50 dinar because they could make smaller piles to traffic, basically. And so he was saying that, you know, it's not really a rule, but there's an informal rule that the banknote, the 50 dinar, when bankers find it, you know, when someone brings a 50, they're not giving it back because the central bank wants to kind of, you know, to sabotage the contrabanders. And it was a very strange thing for me that suddenly the central bank, kind of an institution of the state, and smugglers from the border were invested in the same thing, or, you know, or thought they were invested in the same thing. They were both fighting for a banknote, and a specific one, a 50 banknote. And with that came all these kind of rules. You know, bankers didn't have, it wasn't a law that said that you have to keep the 50 dinar. It was just an informal rule. But also all these media story, like the the director, the governor of the central bank went on TV, and someone asked him, he went on TV, he went to the parliament, but it was like on televised, and a deputy asked him, so is it true? Is the 50 actually the currency that contraband traffickers use? And he said yes. He was like, yes, this is the, the smugglers are at the border who, are kind of the cornerstone of the informal economy, who bring things from Algeria, bring things from Libya. A lot of it is linked to bringing oil because it's cheaper, obviously, in Algeria and Libya. And well, they're using the 50, and we need to find a solution to get the 50 back, right? And so just to kind of wrap up a bit, that idea that a banknote was a contraband banknote or contraband currency kind of, for me, just became so interesting because it became a kind of link between informality, the informal economy. Oh, sorry. Okay. And it became a link between the informal economy and the formal economy, right? And they're obviously interlinked, right? But they're always separated by the state. Like, it was the central bank that was kind of issuing reports saying like half of the economy is informal economy, so we can't measure it, we don't know what to do with it. But suddenly there was a sort of link, there was a banknote that was circulating, and that was a kind of fighting grounds for, smugglers and central bankers alike. And then it kind of mirrored also this idea of imaginaries, right? So it's not exactly true that contraband traffickers only use the 50 dinar. If you're smuggling something across the border, you're not that worried about using one specific banknote. You pile up cash, you sort of put it somewhere. And I did interviews with like contraband traffickers, and when I was like, oh, do you only use the 50? They were all like very surprised. They were like, no, we don't have time to like separate all of this. But it became a sort of imaginary, right? And the imaginary was crystallized through the banknote. The banknote became a sort of material, very visible way. And especially its circulation, the fact that people weren't seeing it that much anymore, the fact that bankers were withholding it, which was maybe why people weren't seeing it that much anymore. But all this kind of, absence of the banknote became a way to think about informality differently, right? The banknote became invested in people's imaginary, in central bankers' imaginary, and people kind of social discourses imaginary of what constituted the informal, right? Something that kind of was pervasive, something that provoked disappearance, something that destabilized, something as stable, or that people thought was as stable as the national currency. So just to kind of end a bit, I want to go back to kind of the two stories. I have a bit more images. And just kind of maybe highlight 2 points. The first one is kind of on currency and materiality, and I want to leave you with that, which is that what currency looks, feels, is, where it is, if people see it, if people not see it, comes to relief, particularly at moments of making the currency. That's why I wanted to show kind of how it changes with the political regime. Moments of circulation, and then moments of destruction, when you have to kind of take a currency back. And that every step of kind of a life of a banknote tells us something about the kind of politics and social processes that kind of make money, but that also imagine money in a particular way. And the other thing is that different things get negotiated through currency, right? And I think the 50 dinar is an example of that. Different power relations and different ideas about what constitutes the economy more broadly, the economy of a country, but maybe also ideas about the sort of global economy in general. And so for me, money is visual, and it is visual first and foremost for power. Because currency, when you look at it, when you look at a banknote, it's inscribed with symbols of the state and of specific regimes. And I wanted to show this picture because these are, I told you in the beginning about a kind of custom police photos of arrests. So this is the kind of images that keep circulating on the currency and on currency trafficking in Tunisia, right? It's images taken by the Ministry of Interior, so either like the custom police office or the regular police office or the special police office, posted on the Facebook page of the Ministry of Interior, of like traffics, of kind of photos of arrest, where you see the kind of this idea of piles of cash and piles of money, right? And often sort of there's a certain violence to it, right? If you see this image, I don't know if I can point, but in this image, where you see like a man from behind, they recreated the kind of arrest. So this was a man that was arrested in the airport. It's the image on the, I think it's your right. They recreated the image. I think it's the actual person who was accused. So he was hiding banknotes on his, behind his back, and they sort of took a photos of that as they sort of took the banknotes away. So there's a kind of violence to it, or voyeurism maybe. But it's also just a way to think about kind of how the visual surface, not what the image, what money is, what it looks like, but also the image of money, right? The other layer that are circulating come to tell you. And I want to think about this idea of visual surface of money as a technique of power, but as something that oftentimes becomes a technique of like subverting, resisting power, right? Because in the example of the 50 dinar, the banknote, a state inscribed, full of state nation symbolism banknote, that's the highest of a national currency, suddenly becomes turned against itself. It becomes the currency of a kind of subversion of the state, right? Of people who are trying to escape state power by trafficking at its border, right? And the banknote is both at the same time. It's an official banknote, but it's also becomes kind of known as the contraband banknote, right? And so in the banknote itself, you have that idea of power and its resistance, or power and its subversion at least, that are inscribed on the sort of banknote itself, right? On the meaning that people put into the banknote. And I think that tension is why money and why currency is so central to study social processes, right? Is that you get that power and resistance at the same time, power and subversion at the same time. And so just to kind of end, when I started, I talked about the idea of like following the money, to follow the money as a methodology, and to think about this. So for today, I only showed kind of visual, money as visual, but we could think about the sensory aspect of money too, right? Like how it feels like, how people touch it. When I did research, so many people told me that like banknotes were old, they looked old, and it said something, for them it said something about the state. It was like, oh, this is so old that, it's because the country doesn't even have money to, print new banknotes. So even the sort of physical feel of money, especially in a cash economy, says a lot about what people think about the place they live in, about the state that they're under, about ideas of economic crisis. And I'll leave it at that, not to take more time, and I'm excited to hear all your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Myriam. And that was quite a journey. The way you are narrating these stories, it was like captivating. And it's not very often that one hear stories about money. It's so abstractly represented and out there that what embodies them, the relationalities that you so well bring out. Such questions seldom come out, and that kind of an ethnography is an eye-opener for most of us, and also something which has the mark of the state, like money, having a kind of a non-state kind of a power, which is like very interesting personally for me. What we would do here is we have our ethnography group here and many others who are like participating within. So I can wait for queries that come in the typed chat. I can read that out. Please mention your name. If not, if somebody wants to ask a brief query in audio mode, you're also welcome to do that. But either you can type in your names and I can ask you to unmute and ask, or you can use a raised hand option. Down there, you can see a hand picture. If you click that, I will call that name and that person can ask their query. Either way, it is fine. So let's wait for like half a minute. Usually it takes a bit of a pause. So so we can wait for the queries and people could ask them. Yeah, thank you. And Myriam, you can also decide to take. Okay, there is a question posted in the Q&A. I think Ronald, did you post a question and I missed that? If so, could you please ask it through audio? Myriam, do you see a question in the chat box as of now? No, right? No. So I saw Ronald wanting to ask a query. He could ask it in audio. Yes, yes, Ronald.
Okay, thank you so much, Myriam, for your wonderful presentation and your wonderful research. I had never heard that before. That the life of money. It's interesting. I just wanted to find out how is this cash economy affecting your inflation and your livelihoods? Because from where I stand and where I'm coming from, it's not really a cash economy. Like now we're mostly using plastic because the more cash you carry, you might lose it. So how do you function like day to day with cash at hand?
Should I respond question by question? What is better?
Yes, you can start by doing that and then we'll get more questions. Then you can decide to answer it together. So you can probably address Ronald and by that time, we can take the next question that has come up in the chat box as well. Yeah.
Okay. It's a good question. I always wonder, like, why do people, keep cash? They don't lose. Why don't they lose money? Their own money. Lord knows I lose mine. But I think a lot of it, and this is not just in Tunisia, cash has never disappeared completely. It's like 10-15% of like usage in like Western countries, for example, because it's a way to kind of have anonymity. So in a country that's in crisis where people are very suspicious, as you saw, like corruption and things like that, cash is something tangible that they keep. People are suspicious of banks here. So for them, having cash is better than having a debit card. And it also, and it's a way, if we think about it in relation to inflation, it's a way for people to count differently, right? Like the less cash they have in their possession kind of allows them to say things about, the rise of prices. Like, oh, I used to have 100 dinar and I could do all of these things with it. That comes often, that kind of thing. And now with 100 dinar, I can only do that. So I think it's about that. It's about anonymity and crisis. And it's about, a kind of a material way for people to make sense of their livelihoods in some way. And it's changing, but it's changing slowly. There is more kind of digitalization of money, but I think, what we can say about cash can also be generalized to also other forms of payment. People count also in interesting ways when they have a bank account and they have a debit card and like an app and things like that. So yeah, but thanks for the question.
Great. Miriam, we have a question that has come up in the chat box. I could read it for others as well. And then if you prefer so, we can also let the next, the raised hand from Tina. So she can also ask after I read this out, if that works for you. So the first question is from Abhinand Kishore. What is your take on cryptocurrency, the imaginations and the materiality of it? That's Abhinand Kishore. And the next question, Tina, you may please ask. I think you need to unmute, Tina. Tina?
Hello, ma'am. Hello, sir.
Yeah, you can ask
Hello?
the question, yeah.
Sorry, sir. It's just a network issue. And the question was about the symbolism of, and already ma'am mentioned about the symbolism of the currency. And I'm interested to know about if you notice any kind of emotional connection of people towards the symbols or towards the design of the currency. I'm asking this just because recently in India we had a demonetization, and the most of the people I interact with are really concerned with the design of the old currency, and they are really dissatisfied with the new one. That's why I'm asking this. I'm looking forward to your answer.
Thank you, Abhinand and Tina.
Thank you so much for both questions. It's actually both things I'm thinking about a lot right now. For the cryptocurrency, I started looking more into it, and it's interesting here in Tunisia because this is, currency is very controlled. So there's a lot of young people who are, working with crypto and just kind of, freelance workers being paid in cryptocurrency, or people just kind of in the Bitcoin market. And for them, it's about kind of a way to escape the country in some way. And it's a way to think about wealth accumulation in different ways. So it's a lot of kind of more educated people who are kind of in this kind of crypto world. And it's quite interesting because they really have a discourse of like evading the control of the state through the currency by using crypto. And I hadn't realized how sort of even for them, it was very political, but it was, a different a way to do, I guess, politics through crypto. So I think it's what I'm seeing a lot in Tunisia too, and it's it's linked, I think, to a sort of global discourse around cryptocurrency by people who are using it, who are kind of saying this is like a radical way to redo, kind of reorganize the world, to kind of get away from a different, from the kind of centers of wealth accumulation, and do something differently, which, is not necessarily the case, because I think there was a lot of study about how kind of crypto is just a new form of late capitalism, but the discourse around it are people who are trying to actively say that they're doing something radical politically, but it's a different types of politics. So we can talk about that more. For the symbolism of the currency, I love that. I've been following actually the demonetization in India too. It's one of the sort of interesting cases for people like me who work on money. And I had an interview last week with someone at the central bank, and we were talking about design of currency after the revolution, and he was telling me that they didn't want to shock people too much, because actually when you change, let's say, a color of a banknote completely, or a design completely, then people get very disturbed. And I realized that it's true. People talk about the way money looks like a lot more than I thought when I started the research, and that there's all this universe of people who make money, from central bankers to the actual companies who print the money, who are very attuned to what should be put on a banknote. And it's a sort of like year-long negotiation. And so there were all these things here about the sort of before and after the revolution of like, if you change the color of the banknote, that you can't change the design of it too much. Like what happened with the 50, they changed the color because the color was too linked to the dictatorship, but they didn't change the design too much. They didn't change the main figure who was on it because they didn't want people to be too, you know, taken off by it. So I think it is a conversation to be had. And, you know, I know that people who work on the banknotes have a whole spectrum of like colors. For example, if you use red, it's too aggressive. If you use blue, what does this mean? And things like that. And that is a kind of an interesting way to think about visuality also, right? Like the color of a banknote becomes important and people have an emotional attachment to, like, you know, I mean, it's money after all. And I think it's because it's such a, like, you know, universal medium of exchange that it becomes an emotional object too. I totally agree. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Myriam. Next, we have two queries. The first one is from Sri Lakshmi, and the second is from Renuka Priyanta. Both are free to ask if they wish. I can read the first query unless Sri Lakshmi wishes to ask it herself. Okay, I think I can read it. So it goes like this. If we take the statement of contraband smugglers' words on 50 dinars on face value, what is the purpose of central bank keeping 50 dinars? That is Sri Lakshmi. The second question, unless Renuka Priyanta wishes to ask himself, I can read it. Priyanta, do you wish to ask? Okay. So what is your analysis of politics of cash in developing countries that is used by politicians to grab and keep power? That's Renuka Priyanta. Thank you.
Thank you for both questions. Yes, for the first one, actually, so some of the context that I didn't talk about is that, like, the central bank, different departments in the central bank had different ideas about what to do with the 50 dinar, and they weren't agreeing at all. And so the governor of the central bank was like, oh yes, it's the contraband currency, we're going to remove it. So that's why bankers then decided, kind of based on that statement, to themselves, you know, keep the 50s and then send them back to the central bank. But the department who handles the sort of printing of money was saying that actually no, it's gonna, then that's gonna create pressure on the 20 and the 10 dinar. So we should keep it, and we should do even worse. We should release a 100 dinar banknote, so that kind of, like, you know, subverts on the other side what contrabanders are doing with the currency. And what happened is that in the past few months, like, the banknote has been kind of reappearing. And when I was talking to banker, they were like, oh yeah, I think things are going better for the 50, because it's sort of showing up. And it has been showing up. I have friends who, like, you know, everyone sends me a photo of the 50 dinar that they have and things like that. So there is no clear policy about what they want to do about it. And I think it mirrors that kind of, like, gap and miscomprehension from state institution towards the informal economy. What do we do with it? What is it even? Is it illegal? Is it illicit? What is happening at these borders? It really mirrors this kind of, like, fantasized discourse about it. And that's why at the end they didn't really have a clear rule. They kept changing their mind, and now the banknote is reappearing, but it doesn't mean that the, you know, smuggling at the border is disappearing, not at all. But it just sort of mirrors that kind of gap between the formal and the informal. And for the second question, yeah, that conversation of the sort of politics of cash, there's a lot of interesting work coming from sub-Saharan Africa on the kind of politics of cash and on the politics of, you know, just money in general. In the context of Tunisia, there wasn't that kind of clear thing of, like, politician, you know, giving cash to people. It was a lot of, after the revolution, there were a lot of kind of, you know, giving goods for, you know, to get votes and things like that, not necessarily cash. And then, but I think actually, at least in my opinion of it, you know, the way that money is managed occurs often at such different, through such different institutions and things like that, that it becomes very hard for an individual to kind of, just use money for its own self. And that's why it can be used then as a tool of resistance, because it cannot be contained by like a single individual or even just a single institution. And so I think that what makes cash, or maybe what makes money, a bit more slippery for political power than kind of more direct other methods. I hope that helps. Yeah.
Thank you. As of now, I don't see the raised hand, or if somebody wishes to ask, they could still ask questions in audio. Meanwhile, if I can ask a small question, what I found very interesting when this demonetization was happening in India was that, if you take a history of monetization, that itself didn't have much of a history. I mean, that itself as a marker of state was yet to get into most nook and crannies of the country, which is India. And that's exactly when, on top of it, demonetization happens. And one of the major things that one could find is that, the coming in of digitized money leaves lesser space to be away from the state, like small things that you do, like decisions that you give to give extra perks to somebody, or the kind of payment that you make in a local shop, the kind of credits that you get at a local level. All of these will no more go unnoticed after digitization. So it's like an extension of the state, and probably more. So I mean, whether that kind of tendency was observed in the Tunisian context is something which I wish to ask. And also, like, because your talk is interestingly replete with something with a visible mark of the state still having a non-state character or a non-state potency within it, namely the way you discussed currencies. So thank you. That's my query, and we could take more queries in audio. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mathew. This is very interesting. Yeah, I love the comparison, and just, I'm happy to talk about, hear your thoughts more on the sort of Indian context. I think it's super interesting. Yeah, there's been such interesting work on ideas about, like, for example, banking on the poor, or the financialization, which is the way that kind of, not just, the kind of the passage from like cash to credit cards, but also the way that kind of the financial economy has become so pervasive everywhere. Everyone has to have a bank account, because then you can't do anything. And I think for me, it's about the kind of state power, but I want us to think about the state a bit more capaciously, which is this sort of state as also maybe like a representative or a way of passage of a global economy and of kind of global capitalism, right? It's not the state just as political, but it's also the state as kind of an agent of the economy. And I think this is definitely that, right? Like financialization, broadly speaking, so from kind of, the little having access to a bank account, to the loan economy, to all of that, has become a way to kind of, bank on social relationships, right? Social relationship of people, exchanging money between themselves, of kind of, loans that are passing through people that have now, are all centralized in financial institution, microfinance, banks, things like that. And I think that's a global trend. And that's definitely something we see. Like this morning, I was reading that in Tunisia, there's a sort of solidarity bank where they give like microfinance loans, and it's a bank linked to the state. And they have their in store, like they're basically releasing their first card, their first debit card. So now when someone, it has a, it's very small loans, but now when someone, gets a loan, then they're not going to get like, they're going to get a card basically, and they're going to, the sort of the payment is going to be handled by a card, which I was like, oh, this is interesting. And microfinance institution obviously have been doing this. So this idea of kind of like you know, a financialization that becomes control, I think is very, very visible. And for the non-state potency, I think this is a bit like my sort of critical optimism, but I think there's so many ways that power and resistance are always in relation and in conversation. And where there's power, there's always a bit of, you know, I say subversion sometimes because I think resistance has a sort of like conscious agency to it. But where there's power, there's at least always subversion. And so money is a good currency, is a good example of it, because we always imagine it as like a tool of like, you know, financial control, state control, global economy, nation state, and things like that. And to see it as something that can be subverted, like I think can help us think about other objects, whether economic objects or not, that have that kind of excessive nature to them, you know, the sort of power and resistance. And maybe the financialization that we're seeing now has a kind of, there are pockets of subversion or resistance to that control that have yet to appear, that have yet to be analyzed. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Myriam. We can open it up for more audio queries. Any of you who's attending, they could unmute and ask, post their query.
And if I can, I would love, like, we can step out of the money topic. I would love to hear, you know, if you have any questions about the sort of ethnographic methods or
Yes.
about your own research and things like that. I would love to hear what, you know, other people are working about. You know.
That will be great. I think some of them are doing that now. So welcome such questions as well. Yes, Anasuya, you can post your query.
Hello. So I was wondering about the way you talked about currency, and how did you take that field? How did you choose that field? And I would like to know more about the way you interact with people when you go into a field. How do you interact with the field? Because when I started for my first ethnographic research, that was a very simple one. But when I went to the field, I was struck. I was unable to communicate with the people. So I didn't know how to interact with the people at that time. So what is your advice for those who are beginning in their beginning stage in ethnography?
Can I ask you a follow-up question? I love methodology questions, so I'm glad we're there. But why were you unable to talk to people in your field site, if I can ask?
I went to a tribal community in India, and I was a bit more. It was actually the place was. I mean, I was from a privileged community in a way compared to them. And I felt like I am intruding to their space. And I felt that I am alienating them. I was actually showing them as aliens. It's a kind of, but I felt guilty that time. At that time, I was unable to ask questions because I felt guilty that I'm using them for some purpose. I was using them as subject or object.
Yeah, thank you for the follow-up. This is super important. And I think, you know, there's all these notions of positionality, your politics, that are very important in ethnographic research that have to be asked. Like, you know, I think to just sort of, why are you doing this research? Not just why for the degree, but like, why are you interested in this community? What politics of solidarity do you have? And I think, you know, I mean, one thing that I've learned is that, you know, people are smarter than we researcher give them credit for, and they know what research is and they know what they do. And so for me, sort of being very clear about what I was doing, what I was interested in, what did it mean to be a researcher? Like sometimes people would be like, oh, are you a journalist? And I was like, no, I'm doing research. It's a bit different. And this is what it is. Usually, like, you will realize that people actually don't, you know, mind. It's difficult in the beginning. And that's why we talk about it as ethnography, because the idea of ethnography is that it's going to take a while, and it's going to take a bit of time. It's not the same as doing one interview, or it's not the same as just sort of, doing like a series of interview for a week and then leaving. It's going to take a bit more time. It's going to take repetition. But I think, you can be very clear with people. You can be like, I'm doing this research on this. Can I ask you these sets of things? Can I, stay here and watch what it's doing? And then if people are uncomfortable, they will say no. And they themselves are aware of the difference of, the different class position or the different regional position. I definitely had that too. And so you can just sort of be very clear about it. Like, I think for me, people, what was helpful is just to sort of like make people uncomfortable by just kind of noting what you don't know. Like sometimes I would be like, oh, I don't understand this because I come from the city. I have no idea. And then people would like make fun of me a bit, but it would make them feel like they were teaching me something. And I think that's usually like a good way to go. And like a lot of it is patience, but also I think just always asking yourself, like, why am I doing this research, and what is my political position in relation to these people? Like, why am I here? Not just for the degree, but because maybe I have something, I want to say something. I have like a solidarity towards these people, and this is why I'm here for it. So I think just, keeping that question open and just sort of being very humble and transparent with the people you're talking to, I think hopefully can help out a bit. It takes time, so don't don't worry.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Myriam and Suya. I think there is a raised hand from Tina if she wishes to ask a question.
Hello, ma'am. You already mentioned that you collected data from central bank, and all of us know that central bank is more close to state, and it's an institution, so there will be a lot of procedures for it. And how did you manage it? That like, did you feel any kind of rigidity while collecting, or are they cooperative? I'm just asking because political system is always complex to enter, and all this we all know that even our even it is closely related to everything what's going to, and currency is also a powerful tool, and its position in our society is very high, and even all the power, we can say money is sender. Sometimes we can put in the sender. So did they cooperate? I'm asking this.
Yeah, that's a good question. So surprisingly, the central bank was much easier than the border smugglers, and I'm still myself shocked by it. I think what helped, and actually this is something I talked about with friends that are working on completely different context, is that I went in through a side institution first, through the Museum of Money that was affiliated with the central bank. And then I started doing an internship at the central bank. So I was very clear, because I think it's very important to be transparent. I told them I was doing a PhD and that my research was on money. You can keep it as vague as possible. It usually helps when you work on like topics like, political ecology or political economy, because people see it as not political. They're like, she works on, money, currency, that's not politics. So it's usually easier to start with that. And so what was kind of two things is that, yeah, I started, there's this thing in Tunisia where you can do like, it's usually for master students where they do like an internship to like finish their master. It's usually a research internship. So it's like they don't actually work, they just sort of gather information and then write a report. So I asked them if I could do the same. They were like, okay, that's fine. So I did an internship at the bank, and I was working at the bank. I was, and then, because I take photographs, they were like, fine, you can also just be the photographer because we need that. So it's, I would say start with a side institution that is less political and see if you can do like a productive activity, or, just sort of use the fact that you're a researcher to be like, I could write a report on this, because that usually gives you more access than just going in and being like, okay, I want to meet all these people. And it's like, I mean, you have to sort of like play politics yourself, right? You have to sort of not be political and use kind of things that are deemed not political. The last thing that helped is that because these were all economists, banker, they had no idea what anthropology was, which was kind of funny because when I started, I was like, oh, I'm studying anthropology. They were like, what? And so I remember one of the sort of a director who was scheduling my calls, my interviews with like at other departments of the bank would call, and I was next to him and he'd be like, yes, so we have a student, she studies anthropology. Yes, we've never seen this at the bank. I don't know what it is. It sounds very exotic. And he kept saying things like that. So it usually helps to, you could say like you do ethnography or something like that. It usually helps when it's not like, direct politics or directly an institution that, knows the language that you're in. Sometimes it's using sort of like mistranslation, what gets lost in translation to your advantage, while, still kind of being transparent enough, because you don't want to get into trouble. And then you can't use your research if you're lying. If you say like, oh, actually, I'm studying something completely different. You just have to keep it very simple and very, you don't have to go into a lot of detail. It's kind of very disconnected in some way. And sometimes I think that's what helped, especially with an institution like the central bank, which is very, central bank are usually quite secretive as institutions. Yeah, so I hope that helps.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Myriam. I was thinking about the context of the USSR, the dissolution of the USSR. Just followed some articles during that time that came up, in which there is this millenarian capitalist kind of a hope in the air. And that's when people enter into very distinct relationships with currencies, engaging in localized economic activities over great expectations. Probably lots of ethnographic cases might have come up from the Russian context, I would expect. I was thinking of, I was expecting somebody from Russia to join today. He would have added on that. And also one thing I wish to ask was like this one concept like credit. If you apply at different scales, it acquires a totally different meaning, I think, because at a local level, credit is something that could be subversive of the state. In fact, probably money had its origin in credit than barter, or, it was probably promises and promises to pay back and then getting that kind of money form. But soon as it reaches a globalized kind of a digitized kind of a level, the same credit has a completely different kind of association, right?
Yeah, I love that. For the first part, definitely, there's so much interesting ethnography on kind of like hopes and disillusion coming from like the, not just the US, the former USSR, but just like the Soviet Union in general, actually. There's been a lot of interesting ethnographies coming from there about crisis, about, aspiration and disillusion. So it's something that it's what we were saying also, what I was saying in the beginning about the kind of, what comparison to other spaces you can make that I find so generative when you're a social scientist. And then for credit, yeah, I love that idea. It's like what this makes me want to ask is kind of like, what is the usage and what is the political usage of using the same term to mean something that is both like, can be this kind of localized social relation and that extend to like a global financial regimes, right? Like, because it's like different, it's completely different scales, you're right. Same with debt, we talk about sovereign debt and we talk about these kind of, indebtedness in between people. And I think there are politics to using the same words to encapsulate all these concepts. There's way to sort of kind of make links, ways to think back about that kind of like who gets integrated into the financial regime that I think are at stake. And I think this is why it's, sometimes our job to complexify the terms, right? Like who is hiding behind credit? Where is it? And scale becomes so important here, right? It becomes about kind of like what different scales are operating, but how are they brought back together, right? And money is an example of that, right? It means the kind of medium of exchange that you buy A from B, but it also means that entire kind of financial system that has completely different actors and different abstractions to it. And when we bring the two together, maybe there's like some work being done about kind of linking things that, you know, should be dissociated in some way. So I think it's that, yeah.
That certainly helps. That thinking, that linkage is being established. Yes. I see a raised hand from Anasuya. Does she wish to ask one more question?
No, sir, it was accidental.
All right.
Sir, you are mute.
So you're on mute.
Oh, sorry, I'm on mute. Sorry. So I was just saying that there could be more queries, and anyone could pose a query related to method, to Myriam's talk, or add angles to the conversation that is on. From other contexts, people are attending from other milieux and contexts. There were people from Sri Lanka, from other countries in Africa, from Latin America. They could also add perspectives on that. Our researchers are there, ex-students are there. Anyone is welcome.
I'd love to know, I mean, I know you mentioned like a sort of ethnography focus, and I would love to know kind of how people are using ethnography, especially when they come from like, you know, disciplines like political science and things like that. Like, how is it helpful as a method for you all in contrast to maybe other ones, or how is it not helpful?
That'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to hear from our upcoming ethnographers. Any of you, you could mention what difference does it give in understanding social phenomenon using ethnography?
I think it is giving us a multidisciplinary approach. So we are seeing it in a very different perspective. I mean, as an ethnographer, or I don't know whether I can call myself as an ethnographer. So I'm in a beginning stage, but so my core subject is economics, and when I deal with when I go to a field, I see more things related to related to economics, or sometimes we are having a multidisciplinary approach to things, and so it is a bit helpful. I would say that's a kind of revealing experience. We would observe those minute nuances that are happening around us, and after joining the course, actually the way I see things changed. All those customs that we see in our daily life, all those things, and our perspectives actually change a lot. So I would say that it changed me as a person. I don't know whether it helped me in ethnography, but I would say it changed me as a person.
I love that. Well, first, please do call yourself an ethnographer, a researcher, everything, you know? I think it's important to sort of use their concept. There's no, you know, it's not about getting a degree or something. It's about just playing with a method. So I like that. And I hope there's going to be more economist ethnographers. But it's true. I think it's about denaturalizing is often the word that people use, you know, kind of things that, when I talked about it in the beginning, the sort of things that are routine, mundane, repetitive, you know, that make so much sense that they, you know, they start to sort of not be analyzed in of themselves. I think this is where the ethnography or the ethnographic method becomes important, because it's actually taking these routine things and saying, actually, this is a door into understanding a social world, understanding an economic process, understanding a political process, understanding like people's way of interacting with other people. So that's why I think it's interesting to hear that. I'm glad it's changed you, hopefully for the best. But yeah, I think there's a question in the chat.
Yes, there is a question from Harissa, so I can read it. I want to know which theorists should I know, or which are the major aspects I understand on digital/virtual ethnography, and or ethnography for research about digital culture or society. That's Harissa.
Okay, that's a good question. The best way usually is to start with like edited volumes, because you usually find a bunch of different scholars. I'm gonna put in the chat the name of two. The first one is Tom Belstorff, who's at UCI, who works on Indonesia, and he worked a lot on the sort of digital spheres in Indonesia. And one is Gabriella Coleman, who interestingly worked on hackers, and who has a lot of, who I think is part of an edited volume on kind of, how do you even do digital ethnography in the first place? And it's been an interesting conversation for people who work in ethnography, especially since COVID. Like, how do you not go to a place but still work, able to do ethnographic research on it? Or how do you work on, cyberspaces? So I suggest these two, and just looking at an edited volume on digital ethnography will give you a lot of insight. And just, try, if you have a specific, space, website, forum that you're interested in, I think that constitutes ethnography as well.
Thank you, and that really helps, those names, and I should also follow some of these authors to see how they work. In fact, to the query that you asked about ethnography, and I'm also a student alongside all of them trying to do ethnography, and one peculiar example that I wish to always narrate is, during land boom, real estate, etc., there was this group of people who took shape as brokers, land brokers, who connect you to, like, if Myriam comes as a purchaser, I mean, you connect with a broker. But these brokers connect with sub brokers, local brokers, and often they are called as EARTH, Earth. And Earth, the English word, is used in the Malayalam context, the local context. And what was interesting for me was that on the one hand, there was an interesting connectivity between the expectations of like high money return that you have, being grounded to the locality by human presence. On the other hand, the visuality of it is very interesting, because Earth suggests, like, big buildings have these earth lightning arresters, and these lightning arresters have metal rods that go to the ground. That's like earthing of electricity. So so I was just thinking of such elements that pop up during ethnography, which makes it very special. Yeah.
And I love the mix with, like, the sort of people's like social status, maybe like own job function. A broker is such a function that is loaded with like social, political, economic meaning, and at the same time, like, the specific object of the rods. Like, this is a way to play with that, right? Like, you have people and you have objects and you have changes, and how do you bring that to all of that together into like an ethnographic moment in some way? I love that example. It reminded me, I'm going to put it in the chat, of an anthropologist you probably know, Mathew, who works on South Africa and works a lot with brokers, Deborah James. I'll put the name, it could be helpful. It's someone who does a lot of like interesting interdisciplinary work for, all of the students who maybe work on land, for example, and brokerage. Yeah.
Okay, Deborah James, thank you. So we can, if Myriam is not too tired, we can take a couple more queries and then we can close the session. But before others go, I wish to, request Myriam that, with both these collectives, the urban collective that we are trying to build up, as well as this ethnography group, can we expect your, occasional cooperation when you get time, to add on and, add on lots of angles? It was so good, the stories that you say. I mean, I can't say it that well. I mean, ethnographic stories. So it'll be great if you could come in at times, in small meetings even.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the invitation. I love these conversations, and I love that we're able to sort of draw connections across places and across disciplines. So for sure, yeah, invite me.
Great, thank you. So if there are a couple more queries or pre-queries we could take, otherwise we can call it a day and request Anasuya to wind it up. But before that, yes, Abhinand has a query.
Hi, I was thinking like before joining in this institution for doing research, I used to walk, talk, listen, take photos, everything, smell, taste, everything. But after that, my approach has changed. Joining in this institution for PhD, actually my approach, not in the sense approach, the way I look or way I sense, it has changed because I'm doing research, right? So I have some questions. So what I feel most difficult is that when I am talking with someone, I am actually taking his time, his labor time, so which is a value. So this question always knock at me, like how am I gonna value this value? So I don't know actually. What's your
You mean value like the person's time, right?
yeah.
Yeah, that's an important question, honestly, and it's one of these, minute questions like that are not often talked about in methodology. Like, so a person is giving like labor, time, time, energy to respond to questions. What you do with it? And I mean, I think it links back to all the politics of like compensation and compensating research people you research, and that's a negotiation that is very specific to the context you work on, and that you should discuss, with other people that know these people or the area or something like that better. But it also, I mean, you can think of other ways of. Well, first, I will say that people like to tell their own stories. So don't always feel like you're taking a lot of their times. Just, be, again, be transparent about, this might take an hour, this might take 30 minutes. If you don't have time, we can stop at that time and I can come back. Like, stay available on that. But I think people people want to be heard. And that's important for them too. So I think it, just as long as you sort of keep yourself, put their availability first. I think that's important. And the second thing is that if you're working on a specific community and you're sort of, you're there for a while and things like that, there are other ways of giving back. Like when I worked with like female factory workers, I would bring my camera and I would take like, photos of like the birthdays or like family photos and things like that. And I would like give it to them. I would send them the photos. And it was like a way for me to sort of give back, like take photos or things like that. Or I worked with like fishermen, and they were trying to like establish like an association, and so I offered to do like translation if they wanted to apply for grants or things like that. So there are like ways of giving back that are not necessarily monetary, but that may come from like the skills you have. Translation is usually translation, copy editing, and just asking people like, do you need help for this? And honestly, when they need help, they will ask for help. So I think just I would say, yeah, just letting yourself be available for these kind of reciprocity are an important way to go.
Thank you.
Thank you, Myriam. And Tina, do you have a query?
Sir, I just want to share something. It's not a query at all. Ma'am already asked how our own disciplines reflects in our ethnography work. I just want to say that I am an economics student, and ethnographic discussions reflects in my economic view, because if after engaging with this group, after start discussions, uh, while I taking an economic issue, I my thinking are now little bit different, because uh, like I start thinking about what will be the social reflections of this, and what will be the cultural effects, and what's going to be happen with people's emotions with this economic change. And I'm so happy with this, because my economic view itself changed because of ethnography. And I'm so happy with it. Just sharing with it.
I love that. That's why I do economic anthropology, because it's like, I think especially economic processes have so, have been analyzed so much just from like a purely economistic point of view, like, offer, demand, quantitative, and things like that. And I think when we look at like the social lives and the social processes behind things like inflation, or behind things like money, or behind things like, land or something like that, then we get so much, and there's still so much to be done. I think this is such an important link, such an important kind of way of approaching economic practices. So I'm so glad there's all of you are like economic students doing ethnography. I think that's exactly what we need to, and people, I mean, this is what happened after the 2008 crisis, for example. So many people are like, oh, actually, like, the economy is not just like numbers and things like that. There's so much more, and we need to understand this. So I think now there's like a willingness to understand the sort of social processes behind certain economic practice. So we should, the more work and the more people like us doing this kind of work there is, I think the better it is to understand, everything from like dispossession to global capitalism. I think, yeah, it's super important. I'm really glad to hear that. So yeah, I was gonna I saw the thing in the Q&A. I was actually just writing my email now. Please feel free to reach out if you have any, questions, whether it's about your own research or about the talk or anything. I'm happy. I love talking to students. This is so nice. So I'm gonna put my email in the chat, and feel free to reach out. Yeah.
Great. And in fact, it's also noticeable that there were lots more interactions than usual today, which is, and people from different fields were staying in, and the ethnography students are there. Our friends were there from Africa, the postgraduate students, other friends. And in fact, right now I saw a colleague who's been working together with me in conferences, Francesco. He joined from Italy. I think he left now. So it was rich, and thank you, Myriam, for taking this time. Julie has a question. Yeah, Julie, you can unmute and ask. Julie, did you raise the hand? Or?
Hi, ma'am.
Yeah, please ask. You can unmute and ask.
So hi. First of all, I would like to appreciate, because I haven't come across such a kind of research. It was actually you're showing the scope of ethnographic research. So, and I would like to ask some methodological questions. While doing ethnographic research, some ethnographers become the part of the community that they are observing. They will become the member of that community or the place where they're studying. But in some events, or the participants won't be interested, so it wouldn't be like that we are expected. So I would like to know the experiences while doing your experiences while doing the ethnographic research.
Yeah, I think it's okay if you're like part or not part of the community. It really depends, and it relates to like an earlier question about like different social class and things like that. Like I did some interview with like contraband trafficker, and obviously wasn't gonna be part of that community. They were like, just by the fact that they were all men, like they weren't inviting me into the trafficking. But I think it's okay. I think it's more about kind of, again, what I was saying, like, what are the politics of your research and like, how are you interacting with this community? It's not, you know, I think it's important that we don't have like a romanticized view of like being part of the community or not being. I think it's more about like, again, just sort of engaging on like terms that feel right in some way, and sort of like always, I think, just sort of always reminding yourself of like, why am I here? Why am I doing this? What is the politics of this? You know, trying not to have an extractivist approach to who you're studying, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be part of the community. That just means you have to sort of think about like, what is your link with this community and how are you sort of interacting with them? So yeah, for sure. And I think it's okay. There's very different ways to go. Some people work on like the community that they're from, so obviously they've always been, you know, part of it. And some people work on other community, but they have, you know, link to political links to. So, you know, just kind of keeping these questions open. They're never resolved, and it's important that they never stay resolved. Otherwise, you know, we become complacent in some way.
Thank you. Thank you, Myriam. Thank you, Julie. So I think conversations could continue over email now, and let me request Anasuya to formally say a few words, and then we'll conclude. But Myriam, very happy that you found time to interact with us.
So good evening all. First, I would like to say thanks to Myriam Amri ma'am, because thanks for the wonderful talk, ma'am. It was very interesting. It was very insightful. And you talked about the representations in the currency, and it was a very new field to us. And the way you narrated the story, I mean, the way you presented was very good. And I didn't want the talk to end. And thanks for all the participants who asked interesting queries. And I think it was a very revealing experience for me and for all others who joined, because you were clearing all those, you were clearing our doubts. I mean, it was clearing a lot of our dilemmas. So thank you so much, ma'am, for this wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks all who joined. Yes, Nitin, I also see your comment. So, Myriam, shall we call it a day? And we'll have such occasional meets.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Mathew, so much for the invitation. This was super generative for me. I love sort of hearing everyone's take on ethnography, and like, I hope you will continue to like explore even the things that, you know, we think shouldn't be explored, like currency or something, or any other thing. And I'm excited to hear more about your research and to sort of like speak more in future occasion. Feel free to reach out. I'm happy to sort of keep these conversations ongoing. And thanks again for everyone. Yeah.
So see you